In this part, and I know this is a long one, guys, but it's prep work for, several assignments. And also, there's just a lot of material in this. Let's talk about learning theories. Now, learning theories we've already explored to a certain extent. This focuses on our ability to learn, to adapt to the environments in which we find ourselves. And we've already talked about behaviorism, and you've already gone through the assignment on behaviorism, right? So this is really understanding how a system of rewards and punishment shaped a person's behavior. That would be operant conditioning, or for classical conditioning, how stimuli in the environment became associated and came to mean the same thing. So whether it's classical conditioning, right, that is an innate response, a built-in, evolutionarily based response to a stimuli is transferred to a new stimuli, would be classical conditioning. This often occurs outside of awareness, right? So this is just one of our porch raccoons. We have several of them. And then how do we learn new behaviors by operant conditioning? Well, it's trial and error learning. We try something and either we reap a reward or get a punishment as a result of our efforts. And when we reap that reward, we're more likely to use that behavior in the future. Right? So that's, in fact, the simple aspect. I'm not going to belabor these because we've talked about them and had an assignment on them already. Now, one thing I do want to say, though, and this is an adjustment challenge. Many of you will have the adjustment challenge of these things called children. And you will have children. And there's always this notion, should we punish our children, and how do we punish our children? And the use and abuse of punishment in operant conditioning is to add bad, right? Remember, add bad to someone's life after the fact. Like this young man is having a bad added to his rear end in terms of a spanking. What do we know about punishment? Well, if I use punishment as a device to maintain my power, then if I have the inability to punish, that is, I'm not there to witness the act or know that the act occurred, then my power disappears. So the problem with punishment in this regard is it's contingent on being Johnny on the spot to implement the punishment. Punishment also triggers aggression, especially aggressive punishment. And notice that when I'm spanking a child, what I'm saying is sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to be aggressive. That is to apply physical aggression. What you have to consider, is that a lesson that we necessarily want to teach our children? Also, punishment focuses on the negative of what was done, but doesn't necessarily offer a positive alternative. So often children are punished, but it's never really explained to them what they could do to avoid the punishment necessarily. Question for you guys. Now, this question doesn't work for me because I'm an only child, but how many of you had siblings? And I loved asking this question in class because then I ask people to raise their hands. Okay, for those of you who've had siblings, how many of you thought that you were punished, disciplined, unfairly compared to your siblings, or unequally? And what we usually see here is at least 3/4 of the class raise their hands. The problem with using punishment, especially with multiple siblings, is people almost always interpret it as being administered unfairly or unequally. And notice, this is not just within the familial situation. We're living through that in this day and age right now, that punishment and response to transgression seems to be largely contingent upon color, at least in the minds of many people. And so people view punishment as being unfair. What's most likely to make punishment work? If you got punishment in your toolkit and you want to continue to use it, well, Jeremy Bentham said this back in the 1700s. It's got to be swift, certain, and severe. That is, the punishment has to follow the bad act as closely as possible. That's the swift part. You want to make sure that the association of consequence is very tight to response, right? So got to be really tight. We don't do that well in our justice system. Punishment is rarely swift, right? It's got to be certain. That is, I have to know that I'm going to be punished, that odds are, likelihood is that I will be punished. And then it has to be severe enough to actually make a difference, and it has to be interpreted as a punishment. I used to get swats in school. I started smoking when I was in middle school and high school, and it was against the rules. And if you got caught with cigarettes, you could get a SWAT or detention. Big mistake. They always asked, what do you want? Ball in front of you, want a SWAT or you want detention? And I'm like, detention's for an hour. A SWAT is instantaneous. I'll take the SWAT, thank you very much. Don't give people a choice in the punishment. that was ludicrous for the administration back then. So then they would give me a swat, bend over, grab your ankles. They'd hit me with their custom paddle. Bam! It stings like hell in the moment, right? But the problem is, then I go out and I rejoin my cohort. I rejoin my peeps, and they're all like, dude, did you get another swat? And I go, yeah, man, I don't know what it is, lapping. He's got it in for my ass, and we'd all laugh and we'd have a good time, and my status would actually my status would elevate, right? And it's like, so while it was intended to be punishment, it had very little punishment value and actually had a lot of positives to it. So it was ineffective, and that's the problem with punishment, is it's largely ineffective, right? So let's talk about cognitive psychologists, the addition on to the behaviorists, right? According to cognitive psychology, that is, some forms of learning has to be explaining changes in mental processes. That is, the way we perceive or the way we view our world, rather than just changes in behavior alone. And there's cerebellum, just in case you were wondering. She's a real pretty cat, right? She's weird as hell, but she loves cabinets, right? And if you can't find cerebellum, then you just have to start looking in all the cabinets in the house, because she opens them up, she goes in, she closes them behind her. So, cerebellum. Anyway, she looks like a cat that we had previously. One of our older cats is named Brain, so when we brought cerebellum as a kitten, she looked like a little brain. What's Latin for little brain? Yeah, it's that part right back here, the cerebellum. So, no escaping psychology in this home. Insight learning, beautiful. Creativity, what is it? Putting together previous learning cognitive elements in a novel way to solve a problem. This is one of the things that allows us to adjust with aplomb as human beings to the myriad of circumstances that we face. Conditioning theories really weren't able to explain this, and it usually doesn't involve some kind of outside stimulus or response combination. It's more of an internal process that really conforms to the notion of creativity. It's not trial and error, because this is usually when we're describing a first shot deal. It's a flash of inspiration, and creativity is thought to be the result of non-conscious processing, as is insight. So here's Kohler's chimpanzees, at least my photo depiction of them. And what we have is Kohler presented the chimpanzees with a difficult problem. He hung bananas from the center of this enclosure. And what we have chimpanzees who desire the bananas, but their traditional behaviors of jumping or climbing didn't work in this situation. They were incapable of climbing up the side or jumping high enough to reach the bananas. But over time, this chimpanzee saw a box in the enclosure and put the box underneath, got this insight, got this idea that, man, if I stand on that box, I'm going to be closer. And the ape was closer, but it wasn't enough. So eventually the box stacking behavior yields the fruit, literally, the banana. And so this is insight, right? The first time this was done, we can't explain it because you've been rewarded for box stacking in the past, so you will continue to do it. That doesn't work because it's never been rewarded before. So the novel behavior will eventually be rewarded, but there was no pre-reward, which is necessary for understanding operant conditioning and behavior. So in this case, and there was no subsequent approximations as we discussed with operant conditioning either. Now, what this means is this insight learning allowed this chimpanzee to, in fact, exploit the materials around them, adapted the materials to gain the reward. I think what's as interesting is the chimpanzee that observes this. Social learning theory predicts that chimpanzee will engage in box stacking behavior in the future because he saw the other chimpanzee gain a reward for so doing. That being said, if you have chimps in your house, you better be careful what you leave lying about, because chimpanzees are capable of insight learning, figuring shit out on their own. So don't let this happen to you. Perhaps the most cited person in all of psychology, right, at least social psychology, is Bandura. And Bandura then developed the notion of observational learning. And this is cognitive learning, where someone generates a novel response to a problem on the basis of observing others be rewarded for their novel responses, right? So we know the Bobo doll studies, and if you don't, I'll give you a brief descriptor. What we're talking about then is Bandura set up an experiment where children they were randomly assigned to watch an adult in a playroom either behave aggressively with the toys or play nice with the toys. Well, the children who watched the aggressive adult, all children were allowed to go into and play with the toys after the observation period. The children who watched the aggressive adult modeled the aggressive behavior. And we say, well, you know, that's just mimicry. I mean, that's not all that astounding. So we see the adult hitting poor Bobo with a toy hammer, and then this little darling hits Bobo with the toy hammer. What they didn't expect, though, you know, Bandura saying, okay, that's what I was looking for. That confirms my hypothesis. But then this little girl goes on to then pick up a Barbie doll. And instead of play with the Barbie doll, she goes and she whips Bobo across the face with the Barbie doll. And Bandura's going, holy shit. She did not see an adult pick up Barbie and hit the doll. So what has she learned? She's not learned direct behaviors, but she's kind of learning conceptually aggression. She later took Bobo over to the tether ball, you know, that rope, the ball on the rope, and she tried to strangle Bobo or hit Bobo with the tether ball. Again, something the adult didn't do. So this is kind of at the core of species that are amazingly adaptable to their environments on the fly, right? That they can adapt on the basis of modifying their behavior. So the power of social learning is she observes a behavior, that is, she watches the adult aggress and appear to enjoy being aggressive towards Bobo. She says, aggression, cool, right? And then she goes and she reapplies aggression, but in a new manner, exhibiting new aggressive behaviors that the adult never modeled. So we have this capacity to adapt. That is by extracting concepts and applying the concepts to new situations. This is amazing when you get right down to it, right? Think about it. We used to throw rocks at prey to attempt to disable the prey so that we could eat it. And you say, well, I watch him throw a rock. I watch him throw a rock. And if that's as far as it got for humans, we'd be still throwing rocks at prey. But we learned that we don't necessarily need to throw a rock, that we can throw a spear. And if we actually point the spear and put maybe a metal or stone tip on it, it actually becomes more effective. And note, from there's the development of firearms, which now this device projects an element. So one of the fascinating legacies of the human being is the projecting, right? The ability to project force, which is not something that's done by many other species on our planet. But you can see how the process evolved, becoming ever more sophisticated. So social cognitive theory, observational learning, then what do we know? Like behaviorism, social cognitive theory holds we can learn by observation. However, not that we engage in the behavior depends on both situational and personal variables. So we can determine when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. So we have this ability that we can choose how we adjust. Now, personal variables then are factors within the person that influence behaviors. So this could be our competencies, our ability to encode or how we encode memories, etc. Our expectancies for ourselves and our environment, emotions, self-regulatory systems and plans. We're relatively complex beings, and you can see then that the social learning theory becomes moderated by so many different psychological processes, for example, that human beings possess. So it's not a straight up then the situation influences us, because we have the power to influence our situation. But we also have this weird thing I referred to way at the beginning of the lecture called personality. So Bandura lays this out as reciprocal determinism. That is, the causal mechanism is not in one direction, but it's multi-directional. So if I'm an extrovert, and let's start in that lower box then, I'm an extrovert, what does that mean? Well, it means that I may, in fact, talk to people, I may be more outgoing. And then I enjoy starting conversations with strangers is the behavioral result, right? And if you put me in an environment that facilitates this, like a social gathering, a party, right, then my extroversion comes to fore and makes me more successful in that environment. But notice that if I learn to enjoy starting conversations with people, that I may seek out parties where I can make that happen, right? So these are all mutually supporting aspects. There's no one starting point, right? I can enjoy starting conversations with behavior. I can find that, oh my God, it was interesting talking to that person, and that might then assist me to increase my level of extroversion, or may increase my desire to find opportunities to engage in the behavior, and or all of them combined. So Bandura here begins to capture the complexity of who we are and how we operate. Now let's talk briefly about expectancies, and this is Chile, by the way. Expectancies to me are fascinating because they're a kind of a double-edged sword. They're personal predictions about the outcome, right, of events, and this may shape then how we operate in the event. Where to me expectancies are weird is they can be tremendously anxiety provoking. That is, if I have expectancies for others, I might become anxious. Will they meet my expectations, right? But the flip side is, will they expect things of me? Expectancy is a weird issue. Now, self-efficacy is my belief that I can operate effectively in a given environment, right? And that's the little engine who could. Maybe the one who doesn't have an identity crisis, if you remember that. Ultimately, when we're talking these level of theories, what we're talking about is the process of long-term potentiation. Long-term potentiation is how this stuff is represented in the brain. This is fascinating to me, but I know so little because neuroscience is not my field. But one thing we do know, that when we see repeated stimulus-response combinations over time, it actually changes the neural structures so that those become more common and more probable in the future. So it's a biological process that moves, physically moves, right, via the glia cells, the connections within our brain, and that's just too mind-blowing to kind of even think about how that works. I'll leave that to people who are more embedded in neuroscience. But fascinating, totally fascinating. Let's talk a little briefly about humanistic theories. What do we know? Humanism. This is the belief, right, the view that people are capable of free choice, self-fulfillment, and ethical behavior. That there are not frickin' weird-ass conflicted beings, right, trying to resolve id, superego issues. It's not moving through crises, etc. It's a movement about human potential when you get right down to it. Positive psychology embraces these ideas, right? So Abraham Maslow, when we think humanism, Maslow is probably as good a place to go as any. The smiling Abraham Maslow with his students there. And we know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what Maslow is saying is physiological needs are ever present in the human being. And these could be id-level drives, much as Freud might describe them. And we see those, but Maslow says that needs are moving targets. So once you satisfy your lowest level needs, now you're free to move up to the next level of needs, that is safety and security. And once you establish these two need sets, your physiological and safety, then you're free to explore longing, belonging, moving up, esteem needs, and notice that the self lecture was really ripe with esteem needs, and then self-actualization, becoming the best possible person that you can become, right? Maslow made a couple mistakes with his theory. First of all, he admits there's no empirical support for any of this. I think that's pretty wild and pretty crazy, and cool on Maslow for saying that. And he says that you're not going to even be worried about a higher level need if a lower level need remains unmet, and that can be demonstrated through our own personal experience, from many people's experience, to not be the case. Interestingly, Maslow comes with these B values, and this is very 60s, 1970s, where to be, right, the B values. So what does it take to self-actualize? And Maslow actually spells it out. He gives us a frickin' list. So do you appreciate the wholeness, the unity, the oneness of being a human being on the planet? Do you understand perfection as being just so, that perfection is what you are at any given time? The completion, the finality, the closure aspect. And he goes down this list of justice, fairness, richness, intricacy. Right? And the reason I put this up, I know most people have probably not seen this, but Maslow's telling us, basically, hey, this is self-actualization. Let me then, in fact, show you the B values. And then he also has a deficiency list, the D list. If you want to learn about that, though, you're probably going to need to look it up on your own, or you can take psychomotivation with me, and I'll talk about that there. So let's transition from Maslow as a humanist to the other super famous humanist, and that's going to be Carl Rogers. So we'll go to the next part and pick up on Rogers.